Right, good morning, good evening, good night, whatever time this video finds you. I trust that you and your family are well. I just wanted to share this morning about the Russia Ukraine crisis, all right, or conflict. I mentioned early on, right, and it's been going for 5 months now since February the 24th, I believe. And just look at some of the geopolitical implications and a lot of the messaging again surrounding this conflict. Let me just preface this by saying, well, based on the public narrative, and many people in the West have one answer to it. Putin is wrong, and Russia is evil, and Ukraine needs weapons. These are the public statements that many of our leaders have been parroting, and I just wanted to go into some of the context that is often lacking from a Western point of view. All right, so let me say that for me, I am not in the business of looking for heroes and villains in international politics. All right, let me state my views. Most people who know me would know that I despise politicians, right? And that's because they the business is one that encourages them to lie, cheat, steal, and then criticize others for doing the same. And that's not an individual or personal thing, right? In the business of politics, it requires individuals to have flexible principles, to put it in a very mild way. Flexible principles, which obviously forms the foundation for a lot of the deception and manipulation which they get into, right? I made the point before as well that persons in politics who tend to be firm and strong on principles don't tend to last very long, right, in our political framework, mostly in the Western world. Lastly, in terms of my just creating a background, right, or a framework for my point of view, is that most people feel the need to state that they are anti-war, right, particularly if they are believers. I don't, right? The Bible itself tells us that there's a time for everything, a time for peace and a time for war. This is scripture. And if you are looking for peace in a wartime, you will be crushed, right? Particularly if you're not prepared to go about that in the right way. And if you're looking for war in a peacetime, then most likely you are America, right? So that is my background, and so I'm not here to defend one position or the other. I don't believe that those things exist in politics. So what I want to do is to go through some of the facts and some of the context that seems to be always missing when this situation in Ukraine is mentioned by persons in the West. Um, Firstly, the view on the war, it is no doubt a proxy war, right? The US and NATO, well, if you can use the US and NATO interchangeably, they are one and the same, all right? They are using Ukraine to fight against Russia. There are many instances where not the slip of the tongue, but that has been expressed by Western politicians. All right, Lloyd Austin and Tony Blinken and these guys. That was expressed as one of the objectives of the war, to weaken Russia, to send by using Ukraine. All right, so this is not even hidden. So that's one. The idea that Ukraine somehow can be victorious if they keep sending weapons and keep sending money and keep up the support for Ukraine is, I think, by anybody who is looking with an objective view, that is a fallacy, right? There is one outcome to this conflict, and that is Russia wins, which means Ukraine would be left with less people and with less land, right? Now, the only thing to stop that is an outright intervention by NATO or the US, which at this point in time they are not willing to do. That's why they are trying to weaken Russia as much as possible, so that at some later point they can then intervene when Russia is weakened. I think, again, that is also a very callous calculation or strategy, seeing that if Russia is weakened significantly and their military stockpiles are depleted, then all that is left is 6,000 plus nukes. All right, so you can make what you want with that. All right, so that is the situation. This is a proxy war, using the bodies, the lives of Ukrainian soldiers to do the work that the fighting that the West is not willing to do. All right. So this has been in preparation. This conflict that is going on today, that many people, because of the media, the Western narrative, believes that it is a 5-year-old conflict. This started with the George Bush administration, right? 2008, somewhere around there, where NATO first announced that they would be inviting Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance. Now, again, the Western narrative is that countries are sovereign and they should be able to make their own decisions and so on and so forth, which sounds great, but which is absolute fallacy, because the same people who are talking about sovereignty of nations and so on apply the most pressure on countries to get them to bend and bow to their will, using sanctions, using military assassinations, using what is called soft diplomacy, by coercing nations and providing payout to political leaders and so on and so forth, right? So if that is sovereignty, then yeah, that's what they're talking about. Sovereignty for the West means doing what we say when we say to do it, or else you would be seen as some type of rogue state, right? And again, keep in mind all the countries that the West has a problem with. And when I say the West, we mean the US and their supposed allies that they have an issue with Russia, China, um, Iran, Cuba. Who else is in that mix? It's a whole lot, right? It's a whole lot now. But again, they try to paint them as though there's an issue with them, and I encourage everybody to go check it out. The issues that exist today, the conflict between these um, powers, they were there and they've been stewing for a very long time. And in many cases, the disagreements, right, or the divergent views comes about by the U.S. themselves intervening into other so-called sovereign nations to have them do what they want to do. Iran is a perfect example, and that has been, that relationship where Iran was transformed from a very open sort of liberal society in the 50s to now a state that the US views as hostile. And the hostilities is because Iran wants to, use its own resources to the benefits of its people, right? And again, that's one of the things that we look at and we see that is what is called, a nation is becoming rogue. They don't want to abide by what is called the rules-based order, right? Or a rules-based society. When Russia and China met in February to announce their strategic partnership, that was one of the things that they mentioned. They mentioned that they are in agreement with the UN Charter, which is the laws that the countries agreed to abide by, but they are not in agreement of this so-called rules-based society. Rules-based society meaning that America make the rules and everybody follows them. That's not what they are in agreement with. Now, the conflict itself is, from Russia's viewpoint, not a war. It is, according to him, a special military operation. And while that is being viewed as, propaganda to avoid calling it a war for some type of, sympathy or softening of the impact, that is in fact not so. It is a special military operation, and it is different to a war because it's not a full mobilization of your troops, and it is an operation that has limited scope, right, which was pointed out by Putin when he announced it, in terms of the intervention of NATO, or the eastward expansion of NATO into the Ukraine and so on, right? I mean, everybody's talking about, that Ukraine has the right to have, defensive alliances and so on and so forth, and that they should be allowed to choose. But if we really look into it, Ukraine is not being allowed to choose. Ukraine is being puppeted. And Zelensky, who's been promoted as some sort of hero and so on, I mentioned in my very first post on the war that we would see if he is or not. And I mean, it's clear to anybody who's looking with objective eyes that he is nothing close to a hero. He is a puppet, a clown puppet, and he has chosen to be a puppet of the West rather than be a puppet of Vladimir Putin, and that's the way how he sees it. He also has another very very dangerous predicament within the country, because one of the things that Putin would have mentioned is the denazification. Again, it's seen as propaganda because they're saying that the the president of the country is Jewish, so it's all propaganda. But when you look back, you would find articles with the same with the same threat of these groups with Nazi ideology, white supremacist and ultra nationalist views in the east of Ukraine. That was one of the problems that was identified by Western countries. Right, you could find articles in the British Guardian, even in the American mainstream news, 2014, 15, 16, all the way around there, talking about this, the problem with these groups, the Azov, one of them, the other, and so on. Right? Again, these are groups that the West knows about, and they know how dangerous they are. And they are not just a threat to Russia in terms of their anti-Russia sentiments and so on. By the way, these groups, with as their ideology, they view Russians as they call them orgs, right? And I mean, it's a very I don't even want to say controversial. It's a very, very strange ideology, right? You can look into that for yourselves to investigate that. But so they are not just a threat to the Russian and the Russian citizens or Russian speakers in Ukraine. They are also a threat to the central government in Ukraine, and they were identified as such by the U.S. Congress, right? So to pretend now that these groups don't exist and that it is propaganda is hypocritical. It's hypocritical at best, right? And it may have way, greater significance where in the way that they are viewing this, right? So I try not to keep this video a little bit too long, but I think the idea to understand and view Russia as they're saying wrong, because they waged an unprovoked attack, because that's the word being used, and you can see it's scripted because everybody's talking about unprovoked, but the events leading up to it is often left out. Alright, so next time, I know I went on for quite some time, but some food for thought, and there's some things that we should really think about and seem to arm ourselves with the necessary information so that we can be informed to make the right decisions and that we would judge righteous judgments. All right, so family, take care of yourselves and each other, and until next time, you are willing, be blessed.